frankly. But I think I was talking about the fact that all infrastructure is designed with limitations. Engineers do that on purpose because we don't have unlimited funds to invest in infrastructure. So highways have limitations, flood management systems have limitations. Now, all of the parameters that go into designing an infrastructure program can change over time, including a community's values, certainly the economy of a community, and we're going to talk about how Florida's has changed. And those changes in a community's values and economies will often drive changes to its infrastructure system as well. Is that too distracting?
Yeah. Pretty crazy.
Yeah. Why don't we just have them turn it off and I'll yell.
Shannon,
Yes.
it was 2 weeks ago that we had a fundraiser here, and somehow that video must have gotten loaded.
So it's your fault.
It is your fault.
It's totally my fault. Sorry.
Do you still hear it?
Yeah, we all distinctly.
Is it better now?
Let's see. Okay, here you go, Shannon.
Okay. Back up, Mike. Thank you. Okay.
All right, we're gonna try it this way. Is this a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit about, no, I'm gonna go away from the speaker. Yeah.
They'll be here in just a moment.
Okay, no worries. I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna keep going. Okay. So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about. I talked about the fact that our current infrastructure system that Rayanne mentioned to you, including the dike around Lake Okeechobee, including the channelization of the Caloosahatchee River. Incidentally, most of our South Florida natural rivers have been channelized the way that Caloosahatchee was channelized, and so the Caloosahatchee.
I'm going to yell. Because this is crazy. All right. So, all of that infrastructure was designed in the previous century. So from the 1920s all the way up through the 1970s, the Corps of Engineers in particular, and what would become the South Florida Water Management District, was busy designing a flood management system to promote economic development in the region. But the economy that they were designing this system for is an economy that most of us in this room would not recognize if we were transported back to the Florida of the 1920s, Florida of the 1930s, Florida of the 1940s, and the 1950s. There may be maybe one or two people in this room that started to visit the Florida in the early and maybe in the late 50s or 60s, but by and large, the state of Florida was a different state. In 1900, for example, right at the very beginning of the very first efforts to drain South Florida, the population of the state was 500,000 people. By 1950, we were only at 3 million people. But by 2040, we are expected to have a population of 26 million people. And if you ask the Office of Economic and Demographic Research, they'll tell you that population growth is actually the state's primary engine of economic growth, fueling both employment and income growth. Now, there is a built-in paradox here, is there not? That the very attributes of the state that draw tourism and visitors are the same attributes that drew most of us, right, to come to Florida. It's beauty, it's natural attributes, it's beaches, it's fisheries, it's rivers, it's lakes, it's clean air, and it's low taxes. And we're going to talk about that in a minute as well. And so the paradox for us in the 21st century, this is it. 26 million people by 2040. How do we manage population growth, which is an important part of the economic future and stability of our state, and it's an important part of keeping us as a low tax state. But the very fact that we're going to experience that growth is going to tax our infrastructure even further. So that's the paradox we have to be thinking about when we're talking about the rate. I'm sorry for the size of this print, but I'll just sort of go over it. So, as I mentioned, the water management infrastructure that was designed in the first half of the 20th century was designed for an entirely different agriculture. An economy, largely agrarian or agriculture, and of course, developing particularly the coastal urban areas, that had existed for quite a long time, but Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and the cities on the West Coast as well. In the 1960s, for example, just to take agriculture, which was such an important driver of the way our water management system is currently designed, in the 1960s, Florida agriculture accounted for four times as much more of the state's economy than it does today. Okay, that's a changing economy, and yet it is the 1950s and 60s economy that the infrastructure was designed to promote. So is it any wonder that the infrastructure is not serving the 21st century economy? We should not be surprised by this. It is an entirely different economy than it was when the engineers, we cannot blame the engineers. They did a great job. My goodness, we're still relying on infrastructure that was designed to serve a quarter of the people that are here. They did a fantastic job. But they have set up this paradox that we have to manage today. Now, other sectors of our economy that are important include real estate, retail, tourism, healthcare, information, and all of the related industries that go with them are going to be the primary drivers of future job and economic growth in Florida. Just looking at, we just included this one statistic so that you can sort of see here. Spending by out-of-state tourists alone accounts for just approximately 17% of Florida's overall employment. That's mind-boggling. And that's totally different than it was in the 1950s. So let's look at Florida's economy today. It is booming, ladies and gentlemen. It's booming. According to the Florida Chamber of Commerce, Florida just surpassed its GDP, over $1 trillion. Uh-oh, good night. I'm having
We didn't have
That wasn't us.
Okay, just over $1 trillion, which means that if Florida were a nation, were its own state, it would be the 17th largest economy in the world. Bigger than Switzerland, bigger than Argentina, bigger than the Netherlands, bigger than Saudi Arabia. Florida's economy is also cooking with gas right about now. Its annual growth rate is above the national average, and so is its population growth rate. So you have states like Montana, I believe, that are losing population, and then you have states like Florida where everybody from Montana is coming. I don't know, so they're coming, but is growing by leaps and by bounds. So let's look at tourism. In 2018 alone, 126 million visitors came to the state of Florida, which is an increase of about 6.1% over the previous year.
Shannon, can we open that up instead of?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Go back.
I got it.
There you
Okay,
go.
is that better? Okay. See this, by having this crutch in front of me, I'm actually not even looking up there. And then according to the Florida Chamber in 2016, the Visit Florida estimated that the economic impact of out-of-state tourists on Florida's economy would be about $88.4 billion and almost 1.5 million jobs. This is 9.5% of Florida's GDP, and as we said, 17% of statewide employment. So tourism has become one of the great pillars of our economy. Now this isn't a surprise, right? I mean, how many of us here in this room started as tourists in Florida? Did anybody? I'm a native Floridian, so I can't say, yeah, my family's been here for about 120 years, but everybody else, a lot of you start visiting in Florida before you decided to come? Right, exactly. So this is not a surprise. I'm not surprising anybody here. Real estate. Let's talk about real estate. Florida's forecasted population growth, which is going to be about 1.4%, is more than the national average. And through 2030, 98% of Florida's future population growth will be due to people moving to the state. So rather than the birth rate here in the state, it's going to be people moving to the state. And real estate, the reason that this is an economic engine or an economic driver is because it drives construction, right? It drives up a huge sector of, a huge employment sector. Now this is what I'm leading to, and this is the important take-home message here. That according to the Legislative Office of Economic and Demographic Research, tourism-related losses, and this is the take-home here, tourism-related losses pose the greatest risk to Florida's economic outlook. We have a number of other economic sectors, a number of other economic sectors, but if we start losing tourism dollars, the future for Florida starts to look very dark. Now the second part of this paragraph. The same office points out that studies of disease outbreaks, natural and man-made disasters have shown that tourism is particularly sensitive and vulnerable to these perturbations, okay? So, what does that mean? When you have a ginormous algae bloom that persists for 5 months or 4 months out of the year, that makes beaches unvisitable, that causes a 78 or 72% cancellation rate in places like Sanibel or Fort Myers, that is damaging the tourism industry, and when you realize tourism losses, you are threatening the entire economic outlook of the state. The solution to the problems that we're seeing here is Everglades restoration. It's an infrastructure program. It is to redesign and remodel the infrastructure to serve a 21st century economy. Now, it's not just that, it isn't just that we're talking about the future economic outlook of South Florida or Florida, but we're talking about the real-time impacts to people, impacts to businesses, impacts to people's lives. According to the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity and Division of Emergency Management, they conducted a survey in the region, and we found out that in 2018, the blue-green algae and red tide events cost Florida businesses at a minimum $140 million. $140 million in losses. That's unacceptable. It's an unacceptable level of loss, and it's not sustainable. Florida Realtors conducted a study in 2015 that estuarine water quality, so the water quality in our bays and our estuaries, have a substantial impact on home values. In Lee and Martin counties alone, there was an estimated impact, a negative impact to home values of $1 billion. In the anecdotes that we heard over the summer, for those of you who were here over the summer, you witnessed it yourself. But the anecdotes that people like Rayanne and I heard were unbelievable. Realtors literally having prospective buyers walk away from $1 million sales during the showing, because you'd show up at the property, you'd get out of the car, and the smell would overwhelm the buyer, and the buyer was like, we're not going to buy here. And they'd walk away from the sale. So it impacts people's lives. Rayanne talked about Fort Myers Beach opening a food kitchen to feed our service workers this summer who are out of work. I went to a meeting in August or July at the Naples Beach Golf Club, and it was like a scene out of The Shining. Do you remember that movie, The Shining? You know, the hotel is completely empty. It's like the spookiest thing in the world. You walk in and there's nobody there. Literally, not even staff is there. It was a very dark summer on this coast. And in the future, Florida's future economy is basically more of the same. It's more about tourism, about population growth, about real estate. And it's about how do we keep our economy sustainable, and how do we continue to be a low-tax state. This top bullet I thought was so interesting, that visitors to Florida pay over $1,500 annually in state and local taxes per Florida household. That's fascinating, right? So if we didn't have that level of tourism, then Florida households, to keep that revenue, that same level of revenue, you would have to generate the equivalent from some other source, whether it's a tax base or whatever. So it's almost sort of like tourism gives each household a $1,500 tax subsidy. It's a job generator. And it's getting bigger, right? This quote is great from the professor at the University of Central Florida, who says, it used to be the 600-pound gorilla, and now it's the 700-pound gorilla. It'll be the 800-pound gorilla 5 years from now, I'm sure. So here's the bottom line. It's clear that the future health of Florida's economy is critically dependent on a robust tourism industry, robust real estate industry, and population growth. The economy is going to be tremendously impacted by future trends in this housing market, and as I said, in population growth. And the nature of our economy makes us particularly vulnerable to what happened this summer. And an algae bloom like this summer is, in some ways, it's like a hurricane, only it's this drawn out, painful thing that does not end. It does not last all summer long. And, you know, I have to tell you that I took my seat on the governing board of the Water Management District in 2007. And we were in the midst of the worst drought in recorded history. And I don't know if any of you remember that, but in 2007, as bad as high water events are, and they are nightmarish, it is nothing compared to a drought, because a drought does not end. A year into that drought, Lake Okeechobee dropped to 8 feet in June of 2008, in the middle of the wet season. And the city of West Palm Beach was just weeks away from having its water supply cut off. Same category of problems, same category of problems. An extended drought event is just as big a threat to our economy and our well-being as an algae bloom or as a hurricane. The last slide, I would say, is the reason that we're really talking about restoration in economic terms is because we need the government to invest in this program, and we need them to invest in this program at a level that is commensurate with the urgency of the program. If we are investing $3.4 billion in Miami's transportation infrastructure, good grief, we need to increase the level of investment to revamp the flood management system to secure all of our futures and the economic future of the state. This is what makes Governor DeSantis' announcements so exciting. Governor DeSantis and Senator Scott and Senator Rubio just wrote a letter to President Trump asking him to more than double federal funding for Everglades restoration. We need to get off the blocks, moving as quickly as we can, so that events that occurred this summer become rare events. Will we have occasion, even when the Everglades is restored, might we have an algal bloom now and then? Yes, we will. But for Pete's sake, we don't want them 3 out of the last 5 years. We can't have them every other year. The economy, Florida's economy, will not sustain it. And the solution is before us. It just takes investment, it takes political will, and because it is being funded by the government, that means it's all of us. It's our government. And so to Rayanne's point, they can't do it alone. They can only do it if we are there supporting them, supporting those lawmakers and decision makers that are trying to do the right thing. We know, according to Mather Economics, that for every dollar we invest in restoring the Everglades, we can expect a $4 return. Now, you tell me, if somebody came up to you and said, I got a 4-to-1 return on investment, what are you gonna do? Sign me up, right? You're gonna write the check and immediately invest your dollars there. Not only are those dollars going to give us a tremendous return on investment in terms of sustainability looking forward, but frankly, restoration projects are some of the biggest construction projects in town. I don't know if any of you have driven by some of the big, or if you went on Tamiami Trail while we were building those bridges. I mean, those are people going to work every day. Those are big construction projects. Restoration is putting people to work. So I like to say restoration works. It works because it solves all of our problems. It works because it puts people to work. So it is not only a long-term investment, but it gives us a short-term economic benefit as well. So with that, now that I've planted the seeds in your mind about a different way of thinking about Everglades restoration and how critical it is to the future of the state of Florida, I hope that this will give you a different angle to talk to your friends about Everglades restoration, maybe your friends who aren't as keen on sort of the environmental part of it, or don't kind of get that part of it. Everyone understands why Florida needs clean water and why we can't tolerate dead beaches in Florida. So, Rayanne, with that, we'll